Hi, welcome to Is This the Norm? I'm Rebecca.
I'm Laura.
And I'm Heather. So today I'm going to be talking about Rapa Nui, or otherwise known as Easter Island. So, where I started looking into this was at the suggestion of Laura to watch the movie Rapa Nui, which came out in about 1994. So, as our Gen Z population says, in the 1900s. And it was definitely a 90s movie, but there was some clear facts that were correct that are still correct today, but there was a lot of Hollywood part to it. But that's where I'm going to kind of start and then really get into what archaeologists presently know or theorize on what's going on with Rapa Nui. Just a quick what Rapa Nui is it's an island in the middle of nowhere. What I always think about, as I was talking to my son about, is it makes me think of Night at the Museum, where you have the two statues that I'm no dum dum, you dum dum. And so kind of downplays that, but they're actually a very sophisticated society for the time. And in the movie, the narrator starts into some intro of the history of Rapa Nui, and it says it's one of the most remote islands on Earth. The nearest island to Rapa Nui is 1,200 miles away, and that is still true today. And it's alleged at the time in the 90s what they thought had been discovered 1,500 years ago during a Polynesian voyage or voyages. They're not really sure how many boats came. And then after discovery, it was pretty much lost to the world once the Polynesians came for, at least they thought for 1,000 years, that these people were just on the island doing their thing. Nobody saw them for 1,000 years until the Dutch came in 1722 and found the island, and that was on Easter, hence the name Easter Island. So that's where the name originates from, is when the Dutch came in 1722. And there's a little bit of documentation when the Dutch were there, but it was so little that it just pretty much said, yeah, there were some statues here and the people were living, and they didn't really do anything at the time. Once they visited, they kind of left. But at the time when the Dutch were there, it was allegedly found barren, treeless, and inhabited by about 1,000 people that were divided into warring clans. And they had these gigantic statues that they built over hundreds of years as a form of ancestor worship. So the statues being built for ancestor worship is still true today.
So,
As far as the warring,
I have a
go ahead.
question. How big is this island? I didn't know there were two tribes. How do they avoid each other? Because in my mind, this island's teeny tiny.
Right. And I was going to get to that, but we
Oh,
can kind of
sorry.
skip around. It's not, no, it's fine. I'll skip right to it and I go back.
I'm surprised
So
that
yeah, the basics.
that 1,000
Go ahead.
people and they're warring. That's all it takes is 1,000
Right.
people on
Yeah,
an island and you
right?
can have a war. That's sad.
We'll get into that. So that's, like I said, 1900s movie. So, this is
Oh,
about
gotcha.
31 years ago.
Was this a
movie was
documentary,
made about,
Heather? This movie?
no,
Oh,
it was a Hollywood
oh,
movie.
seriously? Okay.
Yeah. So that's why when you watch it from, us that watched movies in the 90s, oh, this is such a 90s movie, right? And then it was Hollywood interjected some things that aren't true or wrong as far as when things happened in time on this island. I'll go back and forth and distinguish those two things. But anyway, so it's basic facts of the size. It's a turtle shape. If you look at it, it's a volcanic island, so it's 100% made from a volcano that erupted and then is, of course, no longer erupting, unlike some of the Hawaiian islands. To compare it to the Hawaiian islands, I just felt like that was the best comparison since that's another Polynesian island. The shortest Hawaiian island is 8 miles across. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, is 15.3 miles long and 7.36 miles wide. Now, of course, yeah, there's a littler island in Hawaii, but the main island, Hawaii, is 93 miles across. Maui is 26 miles across, and then Oahu is 44 miles, and then Kauai is 25 miles across. So, yeah, Hawaii is pretty far away from U.S. mainland. I think Hawaii is about 2,000 miles from the U.S., so it's pretty remote too, but it has a bunch of other islands around it. Rapa Nui is all by itself. It's 15.3 miles long, 7.36 miles wide. There's nothing else around. So you got this little tiny island in the middle of nowhere. So that was just kind of the comparison. And then Rapa Nui is about 4,300 miles from Hawaii, and it's actually closer to Antarctica than it is to Hawaii, which I thought was really interesting. And then Rapa Nui, I think it's 2,200 miles or 2,400 miles from Chile. And then, of course, the other island that's 1,200 miles away.
And
Yeah,
so
it's like
my
straight
really
west from Chile.
my guess would be the only way to get there would be by boat.
Or plane.
They can land a plane on there? That was my question. Is there even a way they could land?
Yeah,
Okay.
they do. And I looked that up, and I think since COVID, it's been constricted to one way to get there. What that looks like, I didn't really
Sure. No,
get into,
that's
but
fine.
people are still touring there and going and seeing it and what have you. So that hasn't stopped. That's kind of the size of it, and I'll go back to the movie and we'll just talk about that real quick. In the movie, when the narrator's talking, he goes, descendants of Easter Island called the island the navel of the world, just because I think they thought they were the center of everything and they're the last people. And in the opening, it was like, oh, this they thought that the world fell apart and they were the only people left
Well,
on
I
it.
could see why. They don't see anything.
Nobody was visiting them, so yeah, you think like, well, obviously we're it.
Nobody
So until
here.
1722. So it's alleged that there was centuries of total isolation, and they had convinced themselves that they were the only people on Earth. And then the narrator said, to this day, no one knows why the statues are so large. That's still true. Or why the work on them suddenly ceased. Also true, but I'll get into some theories on why that ones are more believable versus the ones that some of archaeologists come up with, which is to me comical, but that's just my thoughts on it. And then the narrator goes on to say that legend speaks of a terrible conflict between the clans a few decades after the Europeans arrived. Yes and no, but I think it was more of a gradual thing versus the theory in the 90s was it all happened at once and everything just collapsed. And that's what the movie portrays. The movie portrayal is they have these two tribes. Well, I think there's multiple tribes, but the two main ones is that there's called long ears, where it's gauging of the ear, and you have the big gauge in the ears. So the long ears are the ones that are kind of ruling the whole island, and then short ears are the ones that don't have gauged ears, and they're the ones that are forced to do all the farming and build these statues, right? Well, there's no proof of any caste system, but that's how it's portrayed in the movie. You have these two clans where you have this comical chief where the priest is feeding his ear the whole time during the movie. And what it reminded me of, and I might have brought this up earlier, is Madagascar and the lemur chief.
Yeah.
And he's just making bad decisions and listening to whoever's feeding his ear, and that's what the movie portrays. And I thought, did Madagascar get this idea from this movie?
Or better yet,
That
not
really makes
listening to the
sense.
advice and just being crazy.
Yeah, but kind of both, or half listening to the
There you
advice
go.
and then just going off with his own thing, and that's pretty much what happens in this movie, Rapa Nui. So, anyways, it's got a Romeo and Juliet piece to it, where you have the grandson of the chief who's listening to the priest, who falls in love with a short-eared woman, right? And they're getting together secretly, and then of course the priest finds out and tells the chief, and then there's this big, you can't marry her, and so they have to do this whole weird, like she has to go into a cave for 6 months to become the white virgin. It's an interesting thing. So anyways,
Like
the
quarantine.
big thing is it comes down to this competition called the Birdman, and which is true. That did happen on this island, but the way they're portrayed in the movie is not true because it's the way that it's kind of like a triathlon, this Birdman. So you have this long-eared grandson, and then there's a short ear for once gets to compete for this Birdman competition. And pretty much what happens is if you win, you're the chief, right? You get to rule the island. And so these short ears are tired of being the people that have to do all the work while the long ears sit around and get fat and lazy, right? Anyhow, so they have the competition. And what that looks like in the movie is it's a half portrayal of what really happened, but the moai were not is those are the statues that are on the island were not being built at the same time as that this Birdman ritual was happening. They're actually not happening at the same time under archaeologists, but in the movie that's how it's portrayed. They mush everything together and because it's Hollywood. So the Birdman competition in the movie is you have to descend from the hill, swim across shark-infested waters with this surfboard wicker thing they make, go to an island called Matanui, get an egg, put it in a basket across their head and tie it and swim over and deliver this egg unbroken to the chief or the person that's from your clan, right? Dramatically in the movie, the short ear guy, he's winning and he goes to give the egg to his person of the clan and the egg drops and breaks, right?
I think I vaguely
So
remember that part of the movie now that you're talking about it. So disappointing.
Would you really do that? You should be really trying to protect that egg, like reaching out.
Yeah, so
Oh, and
agile and
drop, right?
athletic to get it all the way there just to drop it. Okay,
Right.
give me a break.
Yeah, yeah. Then, of course, the long-eared grandson hands it over and he wins. And that's when the sudden warring happens in this movie. And the woman that's this white virgin that has to go in this cave for 6 months that the long-ear wants to marry, of course, comes out and guess what? She's 9 months pregnant, right? So,
Scandal.
yeah. Oh, so scandalous. So that's what happens is the short ear loses and the long ear wins, but then war breaks out and the short ears go and kill all the long ears and the woman in the cave has a baby and then
Well,
her
all,
dad is an outcast.
if all the long ears are like not working and just getting fat, like how are they going to win a war, right?
Right, which is kind of comical. Oh, and then also there's this one part where the whole reason of this chief wanting them to build these moai is to find the perfect one. And then at one point in the beginning of the movie, they get the newest moai, and he's like, "It's too small." And then of course the short ear, "Oh, I got to build another one." And so he's like, "All right, you short ears can compete in the Birdman if you can build me a moai that I like, a statue that I like." And then they're doing this crazy hurry up and make the moai while this one short ear is trying to train for this triathlon, right?
If you go to Easter Island, the statues out there are varying in size.
Correct.
I did not
They
know
are.
that.
They're not all the same size. The movie is definitely Hollywooded up. And at the end, they have this warring and the short ears win. You kind of feel like, yeah, they deserve that. And then there's this scene where the short ears are, because they kind of light everything on fire and they're eating the long ears that are burnt up. So
Mm,
there's like this little cannibalism piece,
mm.
but that's where the short ears like, oops, we've really gone off the edge. We're eating people now. Then it cuts to this where there's this outcast guy that is a short ear's father, and he builds this boat in a long ear with she gives birth during this. They're having a war. She's giving birth. Hollywood, 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 right? And so they get on this boat and they sail away. The short ear and the long ear with their new baby, and that's how it ends.
Where do they go to Hawaii or Chile?
I don't know where they go. There's theories about them leaving the island, and that's anyways. That's another story. But there is a white canoe situation, just so you know, in this movie. And if you haven't watched this movie, I'm totally ruining it for you, but it's been out for 31 years. I'm not telling you everything, but there's a white canoe situation. But that's the one thing I'm going to leave out for people to watch with the movie because the fact that I gave you that Rapa Nui is closer to Antarctica than it is to Hawaii will kind of explain the white canoe situation in the movie. So I'm going to leave that and not tell you about it because I thought it'll give a piece that you can watch it for because that's kind of what the whole thing is based on this movie is why these moai are being built, at least in the movie, but that's not why it's actually being built. Anyway, so that's the movie. Go watch it. Now I'm going to get into how the movie was correct in some areas and wrong in others. So I told you the size. And then the other aspects of it is that archaeologists have found that it was once covered completely in palm trees. And there's lots of theories on why these trees vanished. One, which I think is not believable, is that when the Polynesians settled, they brought rats with them, which is possible, and that these rats ate all the coconuts. And so those are the seeds that help trees keep producing, right? And so there's some theory that, well, within 3 years, if you brought 2 rats, you could have X amount of rats that ate all the coconuts. But there's really no archaeological proof of that. So it's just a theory.
There's no proof of that?
Yeah, I don't think so either. I'm when I was
It
listening
sounds
to it,
so
I was like,
logical, though.
"What?" It doesn't
No,
to
it
me.
doesn't at all. First thing I thought of was
But
humans. Humans did it, chopped down all the trees.
right, right. And then the other one is that two that they burned them down or cut them down. And then three, which I think is most plausible, is that the natives were farmers and had to clear land as the soil got depleted for nutrients, right? Like, oh gosh, we can't grow anything over here. We got to go cut down those trees where the land is has nutrients and grow stuff. So I think that's the best theory, along with some other things. I don't think it's just one thing that really depleted the population. And I know it's not just one thing because it's the classic thing that we've seen in history over and over. And then there's the theory on when Rapa Nui people arrived. The timeline of theories ranges anywhere from 400 AD to 1200 AD, so it's quite a wide range of when they actually arrived. Recent evidence suggests that the arrival is likely 1200 AD, based on more accurate carbon dating, which isn't, of course, as we know, 100%. So even with this carbon dating, archaeologists still argue that no, it can be 400 AD or 1200 AD. It just depends on which archaeologist you're going to talk to. And I'm not an archaeologist, so I mean, I feel like 1200 AD from all the research I've done seems more accurate. It just shows that there's just still a lot we just don't know when they arrived and how things went down. Now, the statutes on the island, there is about 900 to 1,000 on the island, and these statutes are called moai.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
How was there 1,000 statues on a 15-mile island? So are they just around the edge? Or are they in the middle? Or are they just spread out everywhere?
They're spread out everywhere, but there are certain areas where they're erected.
Seems like that would take up a lot of room for farming and cut down a lot of trees. These big giant statues on this tiny island.
Yeah, and then as far as how they moved them in the movie, they move them with the trees, and there's this dramatic piece where they cut down the last tree to move this moai. I'm not saying that theory is that's not, I don't think that's the reason why the trees disappeared, even though that's the movie portrays it as they were just cutting down tree after tree just to move these moai. That's not why they were cutting down trees. But how they moved them is, there's a theory out there that I think is more plausible. It's not proven, again, all theory. But in the movie, it shows them moving it on their back and putting logs in front of the statue and rolling it to the shoreline. But based on some of the knowledge or the information we have now, there's also another way that they moved.
It was quite believable in 1900. I was believing it when I watched that movie. So,
if you don't know any better, I mean, you would.
It was the 1900s.
And it is the 90s. Yeah, the 1900s. It's all we knew back then, right?
We could use a map of all of the, what do you call the statues again?
Moai.
All the moai, and it is all around the border. There's not very many inland. I mean, there are some, but the majority of them are around the perimeter.
Yeah, I think there's 898 of them erected, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's a lot. Looking at this map, there's a lot of them.
Yeah, I think there was 100 or so that looks like they didn't make it or didn't like what happened or it broke, or there's all kinds of theories on why the moai that are not on the shorelines are just left in the field. So they believe that these statutes, based on, I think, what they call radiocarbon dating, were constructed from about 1100 to 1600 AD. And then I'm sure if you look at some of the moai, currently they have this red part on the top of their head, a top knot, and they're called a pukao, and they're red, and they either symbolize hair or ceremonial headdress type of thing. And that is made from a separate rock carving that's added later to the top of the moai's head. And it's made of something called scoria stone. Hopefully I'm saying that right. It's a red volcanic rock, and it's a light porous rock. And as is this, they are made from something called volcanic tuff, and the tuff is spelled Tuff. So, I mean, they're still very heavy, but this type of volcanic rock is a little bit, is lighter than the basalt. I think it's basalt on the island. Anyhow, this red porous volcanic rock is from a separate quarry on the island, and it's called a punapau. And then it's distinct from the other quarry where the moai came from, which is the Rano Raraku quarry, where the main statues, the moai, were carved from. And so this red top hair or headdress, it symbolizes hair or a high-ranking representative that has high spiritual power called mana, which is part of the ancestor. So these moai actually represent a person that used to be alive in the tribe that's like a high priest or chief or something like that. There's lots of theories. A lot of them say just chief, some say warrior, chief, and priest, but I don't know how much warriors were needed on the island versus chiefs and priests, because the theory of that they all of a sudden just started warring. They weren't really fighting tribes. I'm sure there was conflict, but not to the effect of what we were seeing in Europe or something, right? And there's also proof that these moai had eyes, because if you look at the moai, they have carved out eye sockets in these moai. It's theorized, and there's proof that they had an eyeball with a pupil. So the sclera, or the white part of the eye, was made out of coral. And there was some coral around the island that they found. And then the pupil was made of obsidian. And there is actually a piece of coral that they have found. I'm not sure if it's in a museum or not. I can't remember if I ever found out that fact. But I know some of these moai in museums will have those eyes that they had inserted in there, but those were not actually there. They put them there. And I can't remember how many moai, but I know there are some that they actually took off the island to put in museums. I just don't know how
So
many.
eyes that they put in, are they made of coral and obsidian, or is it just some other material? Oh, because there's a picture
Who
on the
knows?
Wikipedia of one with the eyes put in there, and it looks really silly.
Right.
It looks kind of
Yeah, it's kind of
cartoonish. So maybe they looked
right.
better when they originally made them. You know, those are obviously not the original eyes, right?
But if you look at the moai, the actual structure of them, they don't look like a
No.
human. They have a really large head, really prominently long arms. And actually, these moai, there was one excavation of it that was at the Ahu. And so, what the Ahu is, those platforms you see at the shorelines, that's where they put the moai. And they actually buried the moai up to, I don't know, probably chest or waist. They did an excavation of these moai to see, like, did they have, were there people buried there? What did that look like? What are these moai? So they did this excavation, which was for the natives, was digging up a grave, and that is not the best thing to do, but they, with the natives, and finding a common ground of, yeah, we want to know about it, but at the same time respect the burial site. So they did dig it up, and they, found out that these moai are buried pretty deep into the earth, and that there were remains there to support that theory that these moai were representing ancestors, because that's where they buried them. So they're either right by or under the moai, or
So
adjacent
they're
to
like
them is where they
basically
found the
tombstones,
remains. In essence,
like the
yeah.
pyramids,
And
kind
I'll
of.
explain, yeah, what these moai and burying the ancestors represent, and what the whole spiritual reasoning for
Yeah,
it.
I'm gonna, as you were saying, the long arms probably mean something of some kind of status or some kind of beauty or something, that these statues look different because of different
No,
status. No. Oh,
I
I don't know
have
about
really
that.
long arms. That makes me
yeah. I was
beautiful
just gonna say
to
but
them.
you're very
Yes.
beautiful, so I could
There you
see that.
go. I have short arms. I'm like a T-Rex. So I don't know what that means. If I get close enough, I have a good punch, but if I'm too far away, my T-Rex arms get the best of me.
I
So
just had a
yeah, they just,
flashback to the Land Before Time. Like, he can't swim with those tiny little arms.
Oh, the best movie.
I know, that is a cute movie. So yeah, they are cartoonish because they don't really represent what a human looks like, but there is a whole body, but the face is much larger than the rest. But they are buried, so maybe that's why they look like they're more of just a head, because some of it's buried. The reason they constructed them and why, yeah, I don't really know, other than what I can tell you, which each part of the moai represent and what they looked like. So yeah, they're varying different sizes. Not all of them have the top knot, but they all, from what we know, they represent the ancestors of the Rapa Nui. So, and then I think I didn't get into the fact that they sometimes would start carving these figures while the prominent figure was still alive, because, as you get age, you're going to be like, okay, this person's getting older, they're going to die. We better start carving this moai to make it ready for them when they do pass, likely because it took a while to build them. And then once the prominent person kicked the bucket, they were usually a priest or a chief, and the chief is called a Ariki. I think I'm saying it right. It's Ariki. Ariki, I would imagine how you say it. And so these moai, what they have is a spiritual influence, which is called mana. That's their spiritual power regarding the moai. And mana is a sacred energy between the moai and the remains below the statue, or that's adjacent to it. So this channels the power between the remains and the statue. When it connects the living with the divine is pretty much what that represents. And so it's a living monument is what these moai represent, with the ancestor buried underneath it or adjacent to it. And this power can bring prosperity, disaster, fertility, or drought. The more powerful the ancestor is, the more powerful the spiritual power or mana is.
I would like to
And-
choose instead of any of the other options.
It's leaving a lot up to a statute to decide for you, but that's what we know. And to destroy or neglect a moai was to invite catastrophe. So these statues were very important. And then they also had offerings that were buried as gifts to ancestors with the moai. Again, like you said, Laura, like the pyramids, but it's, a little bit different, more that, you don't disturb it, but these moai were representing, taking care of the tribes. Another common misknowledge with these statues is that they're facing out to the sea, but they're not. They actually face inward towards the tribes, probably because they're looking over the tribes, right? So you see them in different parts all over the island, depending
That
on
is
where the
so
tribes lived.
sweet and comforting.
Yeah, it is really.
Yeah, like
Mhm,
your
mhm.
ancestors are with you and they're watching over you, and that's really loving.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting dynamic with it for sure. And that, they're looking, probably creates a safe feeling too, that they're overseeing you, looking at you, making sure you're being taken care
And
of.
to be able to like the ones, or maybe they didn't love them because they were rulers and they were mean. I'm not sure. But I'd like to think that it was
Yeah, I
loving
don't
and
really
sweet.
know.
And
Yeah, and these clans or tribes were, they feel like there was about 7 to 18, depending on the time on the island. And it seems like there was a competition of who had the best moai. So there was some competitive nature to it from what they can gather from these moai. Because it's not just one area where these moai are erected. As Rebecca said, it's all over on the coastline, and all of varying types and sizes and representation. In the movie, like I told you, they represent rolling moai to the ahu, which is the platform where they erect the moai. And actually, recently, archaeologists think that these statues were walked, which is really interesting. And so I watched, it's on National Geographic, you can get it on YouTube, where these archaeologists recreated, like they did, I think, with the pyramids, where they recreated how this could have possibly happened. What feeds into this theory are multiple things. There's this intricate road system all over the island, and these roads are between 3 and 6 degrees. There's a 3-degree max uphill on all these roads and a 6-degree max downhill, which would support that these roads are pretty flat, so they could walk these moai to the ahu. And how they did it, and it's funny because if you watch the National Geographic, they recreate one of these moai, which is kind of on the smaller side. It's only 13 feet and it's 13 feet? No, they only did a 10-foot one, sorry. And it was 7 tons, which is about 2,000 pounds. And then the average on the island is 13 feet and 14 tons, which is 4,000 pounds. The one they recreated was pretty small compared to some of them that were 18 feet. Some of them are 18 feet tall on the island. Yeah, so they recreated one that was 10 feet and 2,000 pounds or 7 tons. And at first they're trying to walk it, or it's this intricate rope system that they put on it to try to recreate this. And then they have like a boom where so it doesn't fall over either way. So it's cheating, but at the same time, they're trying to figure out how did they actually do this
when you initially said
without it falling.
they walked it, in my mind, I'm thinking a pallbearer they're hanging onto it with a platform under it and human beings are walking it. But what you mean is I would just looked up, these statues have a forward lean and they use these ropes to tip the statue and walk the actual statue itself. The statue is walking to where it's going.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. In the National Geographic show, they were just having a hard time because they weren't tying the ropes in the right place. First, they were doing it around the neck. And so as they finally moved up to the eye sockets, where they have the big divots, and tied it around their forehead, that's where they were able to finally get that perfect balance, disconnected it from the boom, and actually were able to walk the statue. So they were able to recreate this walking of the statue. And so what supports that these statues were walked was because the way they had found some of the moai on Rapa Nui were either fallen on their back or on their face. And this is supported by the fact the moai have fallen either way, is that ones that fell going uphill, so if you think about going uphill, fell on their face. If they weren't walking them just right up that 3-degree incline, which is not a lot, and if like pulled too hard and they fell on their face, they would just leave them there because they just couldn't get them erect again, or that's the theory. And then in ones that fell going downhill, ones that fell going uphill fell on their back, and then ones that were going downhill fell on their face. So that makes sense because that's where the gravity is. And they find some in the island that's where they're either on their face or on their back, and it's allegedly or theorized that they're on those certain degrees of where these moai fell. So that's what the supporting fact of the walking is, which I think is very plausible. It's still just a theory. We really don't know how they moved these moai, but the two theories are they did the log rolling thing or walked them.
So do they know if this statue fell? What, do they just build a new one?
I guess.
I mean, do we know how long it took to build one of these statues? Is there a time frame of?
I couldn't really find that.
Yeah.
I would say years because, I mean, if they're between 13 and 18 feet, and they're actually carved them out of the stone. So you'll find ones on the island where they're half carved and they just stopped. It's not like they cut a chunk of rock out and then carved it. They actually carved it out of these volcanic quarries.
Kind of like Mount Rushmore and Crazy Horse.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good example. They just carved it in the
and
rock.
Then I was wondering, the scoria hat or hair that was just placed on top and was heavy enough to just stay. Okay.
And then I didn't really find
like how did they get that on top?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That's a really good question. I really didn't find
Yeah,
out
I mean,
about
I'm
that.
sure they
Maybe
just
that's on
don't
me,
know.
but- I mean, you could research as to, I mean, how many things I read and looked up is a lot.
Well, yeah, I
So,
mean, the pyramids, there's just a lot of mystery.
Yeah. I got obsessed for sure. I mean, disclaimer, I really didn't know a lot about Easter Island. That's why I laugh at myself, as the only reference I really had before researching this was Night at the Museum and the two statues. I'm no dum-dum, you dum-dum. That's the only reference I have, which is an insult.
I was just going to say,
Moai,
that's
I
kind of
feel.
terrible now that we know how like sacred and special these statues are to these people. Oh, kind of hurts my heart.
It does. So I'm not trying to make fun of the moai. I'm actually making fun of Hollywood for representing the
For
statues
sure.
in that regard, you know, and hopefully it can be taken lightly. But yeah, I mean, I have the utmost respect for.
There's no way you can
what
do as
these
much
people did
research as
during
you
the
did
time.
and not feel that way about Easter Island. I'm sure you just has
Right.
completely fallen in love with the people and what you've learned about them. How could you not? They
Yeah.
sound pretty cool.
Yeah. They do. They are pretty awesome, and I'm gonna get into some more amazing
Okay,
things.
keep
about
going.
them.
Sorry, I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm gonna hurry up. I'm trying not to make this too long. There's just so much. Talked about how they might have fallen, how they might have been moved. Anyways, regardless of how these statues were moved, the final destination, like I said, is the Ahu. And there's often a misconception that these moai are facing out to the sea, but they're facing inland. There's none that I'm aware of that are facing out to the sea. And if they are, it's probably because they're inland and they fell or they didn't get to where they needed to go. And there's also no evidence that any Rapa Nui were ever crushed by these moai from the transfer of the quarry to the Ahu, which there's a part in the movie where one person is crushed, but it's not really based on because they're moving it and he accidentally got in the way. What happens in the movie is that the master carpenter, I think is what he's called, which even though it's stone, but anyway, quarry person, he gets taken off the project and it's given to somebody else. And this master carpenter has been doing this like his whole life, making these statues and leading the carving and transfer of them to the platform. And so he just feels lost. And so they're trying to move this statue in the movie and they're like, get out of the way, it's falling. And he sees it falling and he's like, whatever, I'm out of here. So it's a quasi-suicide scene. So it's not move. And he was like, oh no. And he tried to get out of the way. He let it fall on him. There's no facts or evidence that anybody was squashed by Moai. Not say it didn't happen, but there's just no evidence of it other than in the Hollywood movie. So anyways, that's that. Okay, so the Rapa Nui people. I like to always start here because I love food. Is like, what did they eat, right? Well, allegedly ate sweet potatoes, fish, and chicken, or the birds on the island. So I think there's theories that these sweet potatoes, because it's definitely a Polynesian staple, that they probably brought seeds or potatoes with them on their voyage. And that's how they got sweet potatoes, I'd imagine. And then there's this wild theory that there's a mixture of some DNA from South America, that it wasn't just Polynesians, but maybe South Americans came there because Chile is the nearest mainland. And this is only supported by some DNA that they've gotten from the chickens that show that these chickens came from South America. Doesn't mean that South Americans were there when the Rapa Nui people were there, but that's a theory. And then what else? And that the South American food is also sweet potatoes, so that it could have came from South America, but it's also Polynesian food. So there's really no evidence, I think, in the bones that they've found on this island that support that there was a South American influence. And the reason they kind of bring that up is just because of the carving of the statues is very similar to the Incans. Like Laura, when we went to South America and we saw all those ruins and learned the history of when the Spanish came in and that influence, or there was warring going on there too. So that's what they're trying to think. Where did they get this idea to do these statues? And they're trying to connect it back to South America because that was a big thing that the Incans did. We really don't know. There is some evidence of 10% of the DNA in these Rapa Nui are South American. And the theory is based on this massive tribal battle and the Rapa Nui that are mainly Polynesian. And there was this one South American man that survived, and he went on to have lots of babies. And that's where the 10% of the South American DNA comes from. Pretty far-fetched, but that was one of the theories that I heard. So who knows? Like, I don't know why the DNA mix up. And who knows that if maybe we're getting it wrong and later on with DNA analysis, it'll show something different. Who knows? And then as far as the short ear versus long ears, did that exist? Likely not. It's actually a mistranslation of long ears versus short ears. So what really means is that the translation for the word long ear actually refers to tall, slender stature of body type, not the ears. And then the short ear word actually means people that are of short stature, longer ears, and a more prominent nose. So the long ear versus short ear theory is not really what those words represent. And that's because this language is not as well known as other languages, because it's kind of this typical native oral passing. And then outside of the mistranslation, long ear versus short ear, like I said earlier, they had multiple tribes, either 7 to 18 on the whole island. They also have these indigenous script that's called Rango Rango, which are hieroglyphs. And unfortunately, it is undecipherable because no one to date has been able to decipher them. And this is due to the fact that the Rapa Nui that were literate and could decipher or translate the glyphs were taken by South Americans for slavery in the 19th century. So around the 1860s, I think it was Peruvians came and took half the population, or a third to half the population, for slavery. And so they weren't able to translate. So anybody that could was taken. The abduction resulted in the death of the last Ariki, which is the king who could read I think it's Rongo. Did I say Rango? I meant Rongo script. And these glyphs are on wooden tablets in caves on the island. They don't know what it says. And then the language is called Rapanal, and currently only about 10% of the Rapa Nui residents under 18 are fluent. The language was previously discouraged or restricted in public, but there are efforts being made, including school programs and bilingual education, to bring it back. So that's really cool that they're not going to lose that language. And as I spoke about earlier, the first discovery that is documented of Rapa Nui natives was by the Dutch in 1722. And when the Dutch were there, they noted that the statues were in good condition and used for ritualistic reasons. And then in 1774, Captain Cook and his crew arrived at Rapa Nui and documented that there was a society in crisis and many statues were overturned and damaged. And then fast forward almost 100 years, In the 1860s, the Peruvians came and enslaved them, a third to half the population, about 1,500 people. They just took them, and most did not come back. They were forced to work at the Chincha Islands guano deposits where almost all died. I don't know what they were doing there. I didn't really get into that, but it was pretty horrific conditions, it sounds like. And then at some point, there was they tried to bring them back, the remaining Rapa Nui, but there's only documented about 15 out of the 1,500 were brought back. So, yeah, not such a good job on that. And then, of course, this influence of other countries brought disease like smallpox, which even reduced the population more. And the Rapa Nui people got down to 111 in 1870.
Oh, that's not good.
Leading to a collapse of the island's social, political, and cultural structure. It's better now, but still, it's probably influenced by other genetics of the Chilean people and whoever else came to the island. And the other is, questions we've had is why the sudden seize of the moai statutes, and what's the theory behind that? So the theory is that there was an abrupt stop to building these moai around 1600. There is reported vandalism or felling of the moai in the 17th and 18th century, where they were knocked off the platform or ahu, often face down. A study suggests this was gradual, intentional process than a sudden chaotic, like mooring. That, as conditions got worse on the island because of less resources and what have you, and that's kind of what it was like. Okay, my ancestor's not helping me anymore is what I'm imagining. Boom, we're going to knock them over. Or, we really don't know why, but there's theories of that. And this was likely due to resource issues and required more time and attention. And so, like, okay, we're building these statutes, but we don't have enough food. Our farming is, having issues where our soil is depleted or resources depleted. We don't have time. We need to just learn how to survive. So that's probably why these statutes stopped, that they had to decide on what was most important in that culture. They turned their rituals into something called the Tangata Manu, or the Birdman, which is represented in the movie. They weren't building these statues at the same time that they were doing this Birdman ritual. It was a change in religion. I don't know if that's, but just a change in how their spiritual guidance went. They went to this Birdman situation. And this was around the 18th and 19th century. It was a competition held to determine the political leader. And the winner became the sacred person that represented the god Maki Maki and had supreme authority for 1 year. And so what the real competition was is the priest determined the contestants. The contestants would swim to Mata Nui. This might sound familiar because this is also the fictional island in Moana, where her and her tribe lives. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And they would swim from Rapa Nui to Mata Nui in shark-infested waters, capture an egg from a nest as an offering to the Maki Maki god. They stay on Mata Nui for a few days, maybe a week, and they fast to honor the god. In the movie, that's this triathlon that's happening all at once, but actually in history, it was they would stay on the island for a week or so and fast. And then they would swim back to Rapa Nui with the egg intact in a little basket tied around their head. And that's true. That's depicted in the movie. The winner would be the Tangata Manu, or the Birdman. And there would be a procession that he led where he was painted in shades of red and white. He's adorned with gifts and food before going into isolation for a year. And during this isolation, he would just eat and sleep while wearing a headdress made of human hair, while letting his body go unmanaged and ungroomed for the first 5 months. And this is documented because missionaries came, the Catholic missionaries came, and they're like, you're not doing that anymore. This was stomped out by the Catholic missioners when they converted the Rapa Nui. This is no longer a practice on Rapa Nui, but there is a little more evidence because Catholic missionaries came. And I think this was happening around the 19th century, maybe 18th. So anyways, these are some of the, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the term ecocide, which is a fancy way of saying you go in and you just deplete all the resources of an area of land. These are the ecocide theories of Rapa Nui and kind of what happened. So one of the theories is the trees were cut down on the island to make more land for farming. I think that's the most likely one. And then the soil was depleted of nutrients for the farming, so they had to keep cutting down trees. And because of this, the Rapa Nui were building a farming system called rock mulching once they ran out of soil that was nutrient rich. And this is where they transferred tons and tons of volcanic crumbled rock to create these large areas of rock mulch fields. And archaeologists say this transfer of volcanic rock was more impressive than the building and movement of Moai. I don't know, but that's what they say because it was just so much rock that they transferred to make this rock mulching.
And did this
And-
like add specific nutrients to help plants grow? Is that
Yeah, I
the-
think it is more impressive than building the statues that they knew to even do that to
Right, that's my
help their
thing is like,
farming.
how did they must have
Yeah.
saw something with these rocks and were like, oh, look, there's plants coming out of the rocks from our quarry.
I
Huh.
bet so.
I don't know. I don't
Probably.
really know how they came up with that. but
Because
it
like
is
bird
impressive.
poop will do that. You poop on a rock and then a plant will, grow from the seed from the bird poop. I bet
Right.
that is what could have triggered it.
Yeah. And so there's across the island, there are billions of stones moved for rock mulching fields. And this increased the nutrients, like you said. For example, the phosphorus leaked into the soil from the crumbled rock, and the rock helped retain moisture in the soil. And so I know that in the National Geographic show, it shows this rock mulching, and then there's some plants growing out of it. Well, probably just to depict their theory and support it. But I mean, there's obviously it really happened because all these rocks were moved to make these fields. And then the other unlikely theory of the depletion is the rats. Or in the movie where they cut down the last tree to move the moai, but did it? No. I think this is a tiny island. They say that there's up to like, I don't know, thousands of people on there. It's a very small island that the resources are going to get depleted over time pretty quickly. Anyways, the myths of Rapa Nui are cannibalism. Zero proof of this other than what's shown in the movie. And there's no, how they've seen cannibalism in other tribes because there's markings on the stone that show they scrape the meat off the stone to eat it. There's no evidence of that. There was an archaeologist she is a Rapa Nui native, and she thinks there was cannibalism, but she doesn't tell you why she thinks that other than that's just what she thinks. So some of the natives still believe that's true. And then the Birdman worship and rituals were not during the Moai building period of the Rapa Nui, like is depicted in the movie. No evidence of a caste system where you had tribes that were more powerful than the other. It just sounds like everybody kind of had their tribe, and I'm sure there was some competition and issues amongst the tribes. What that was, I don't know. And the other myth is that disappearance of trees was not due to the tribes using massive amounts of trees to move Moai. There's not really any evidence of that. It's more the farming is more likely. And there was not a sudden chaotic collapse in warring tribes because Rapa Nui cut down all the trees or because of resource issues. I mean, there might have been some warring over the resource issues, but it wasn't like depicted in the movie that it all of a sudden just happened and everything collapsed. It's more of a gradual resource issue and the sudden indigent servitude, aka slavery of the Rapa Nui in 1860s that caused their massive decline. Like typical European influence comes in or other countries and kind of exploits these people. That's what happened. Even with all this, the Rapa Nui adapted and survived. I mean, they're super impressive. Super, super impressive in my opinion, especially with the rock mulching and figuring that out. It's pretty remarkable with all these odds that were against them with slavery and being in the middle of nowhere and having no influence. Some parallels that I noticed with our society is that every country builds large statues to represent the dead, right? That's what we do. And then it kind of like reminded me of the biblical story of Babel, where there's like this unified effort to build these statues, people working this diligently together and for years and years, and primitive tools to represent their ancestors. It's just a very loving community. We don't want to always talk about the bad of everything that happened, but I'm sure there's a lot of good that these people had with each other, and it's still being represented to this day because they're trying to learn their language, figure out how to translate things. So, and then the other thing is kind of the use of resources without foresight of care on how it will affect tomorrow. I don't think that they necessarily thought that because they don't know like we know today, but kind of depleting our resources, we're doing that now. It happens and you have to adapt and figure it out, and they did that. So I think they were ahead of their time if you think about it in all reality. present day issues on Rapa Nui is the Chilean government. They're the ones that own the island. So the Rapa Nui are fighting for independence and indigenous rights to this day. Sound familiar? Same thing that's happening in the US. So it's just a kind of the same thing that's happening all the time. People come in, exploit the people, take their land, and then now we're like, "Oh, we're so sorry. We'll give you this." Well, we want more. Oh no. Well, it was theirs to start with, right? So they're fighting over living space and territory on the island. I think there's about 8,000 people there now, and so it's a little population, but I feel like that's a lot for such a small island.
Yeah,
So
that is a lot.
mhm.
I feel like there was a period of time, maybe it was because it wasn't settled until this millennium or shortly before then, but there was a period of time when they were obviously doing well because they had time to build these statues. Like they're like, life is good, fishing's great. We're growing some sweet potatoes and so we have time to build these statues and do extraneous activities, and then maybe that fell by the wayside. Too many people, not enough resources later on.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on, and that's kind of what I found. And yeah, there's so much more out there about this island that I'm probably missing, and I'm sure our listeners will let me know if I said something wrong or misstated. But yeah, there's nothing that's concrete, really, other than we know they built these statues, and we're pretty sure we know what they represent. So yeah,
I
that's
always
kind of
find it
all I have.
funny when I feel like typically in general, people have this idea that just because a group of people are isolated on an island, that they don't know, or that they're not intelligent, or that they can't like adapt and figure things out. And it seems like it's a continue discovery every time. We're like, oh gosh, they knew to do this because of this. And it's, well, yeah, they're humans. They're intelligent. Just because they're isolated doesn't mean that they can't problem solve and figure these things out, right? I feel like a lot of Europeans would come to these islands and be like, let us help you because you're these dumb islanders that don't have a clue. When in reality, obviously, all they did was destroy a beautiful thing and they were doing just fine.
Yeah, that's my thoughts on it too, 100%.
Yeah,
We don't give them
weren't
the credit they deserve.
We weren't doing good conservation techniques back then either in Europe or anywhere.
Yeah.
Stay, actually.
True.
Yeah, it's the same old story. Come in, bring disease, exploit, and leave. So it's really sad. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting history there. And I hope that the people that are there are taken care of and respected and do better than we do.
Thanks for sharing this with us, Heather. It was very interesting.
Yeah, and
Fascinating.
kind of the thing we say, is this the norm? I think it is. I mean, this is a typical situation, unfortunately, twofold, that humans know how to adapt. They know how to take what they have and make the best of it. And the norm of when somebody interrupts that ecosystem or island life, really unfortunate. So yeah, well, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.